Hello and welcome everyone to this special lecture about DFT models of compositionality. So before I can explain what compositionality is, I would like to review the notion of perceptual grounding, which was the focus of last week's lecture. So generally speaking, perceptual grounding is the process of associating natural language with denoted perceptual representations. And many authors have argued that this is a necessary step to account for how humans understand language and also to build artificial systems that can actually understand language. And this can be exemplified with this phrase. So assume that a speaker says to a listener, the black swan, or look at the black swan that sits below a tree. And the question is, what is necessary in order for the listener to actually understand that phrase? And perceptual grounding essentially is the one crucial ingredient to the understanding, where the listener associates the individual words with perceptual representations, which encode or which comprise the meanings of the words. That's one part of perceptual grounding. And the second part of perceptual grounding is identifying the object that was referred to in a given scene. So assuming that both the speaker and the listener are looking at a shared scene, and the speaker says, look at the black swan that sits below the tree, then the listener has to establish reference to the world in order to be able to follow what the speaker is saying. So that's the second part of perceptual grounding, where the whole phrase is associated with a certain perceptual representation of the object that was described, right? So the object has to be identified in the visual perceptual representation. And yeah, so we have these two aspects of perceptual grounding: associating the words with their perceptual meaning and identifying reference to the world, or rather reference to the perceptual representation, which is the meaning of the whole phrase. And to zoom in a bit on the first step of this process, so what does it mean to associate the words with the denoted perceptual representation? It means that each word has some sort of perceptual meaning, and this perceptual meaning is involved in understanding the phrase. So for example, when we hear this phrase, then we have to associate the word black with its perceptual meaning. We refer to this as a concept. So we associate the word black with the concept of blackness, which is a perceptual representation that characterizes what it means for an object to be black, for example. And similarly, we associate the word swan with a perceptual representation of the category of swans. What do swans usually look like? And similarly also for prepositions, so words that denote a relationship, like below, we also associate a certain perceptual meaning with that word. And we also have to incorporate that in order to make sense of what the whole phrase means. Yeah, so all of the concepts which comprise the meanings of the individual words, concept of blackness, a concept of a swan, concept of belowness, a concept of sitting, concept of tree, and so on. All of these concepts are need to be involved in understanding the whole phrase, and also then effectively in order to establish reference to the world, because you can only find the object that is denoted in this phrase by virtue of these other perceptual representations. And it's called grounding because the natural language phrase and the individual words themselves have no meaning by themselves. So they point to something other than themselves. They are, in a sense, symbolic, so they stand for something. The word black stands for the concept of blackness. The word swan stands for the concept of a swan or the category of swans. And the whole phrase stands for a certain object in the world. And grounding means sort of resolving the meaning of the symbol by associating it with what it stands for. And perceptual grounding is then the additional claim that what the words stand for are perceptual representations. Yeah, so the word black stands for a perceptual representation of blackness, word swan for a perceptual representation of swans, and so on. And the whole phrase stands for a certain perceptual representation that you're currently perceiving in a given scene. So that's perceptual grounding. And as I've briefly reviewed in the last session, there are DFT models that do enable perceptual grounding. And if we want to further characterize what can be perceptually grounded, then we can see that the models so far are able to perceptually ground adjectives, like, for example, the adjective red, or the phrase the red, like the object that includes that adjective, noun phrase that includes that adjective, by virtue of a visual search mechanism. Yeah, so grounding the phrase the red object, or grounding the adjective red, involves activating a concept of redness and then identifying the red object in the visual array. So assuming that you're looking at a certain scene, so here we have a toy scene where which could be thought of as a map that's viewed from the top, and perceptually grounding an adjective then surmounts to activating the perceptual representation of redness, and then grounding the phrase the red would surmount to visually searching for a red object in the visual input. And the same holds true for nouns. So grounding a noun would mean activating a prototypical representation of the noun. And then again, grounding the whole phrase surmounts to visually searching for a tree in the visual array. And more interestingly, perhaps, the previous models also enable the grounding of relationships or prepositions. Yeah, so preposition is like the linguist's way to refer to this, but some people prefer to just say we're grounding a relationship. So an example for such a phrase which contains a preposition would be the tree to the left of the lake. Yeah, so left of is essentially it denotes a certain spatial relationship, and the whole phrase describes an object. So grounding that phrase would surmount for finding the tree which is to the left of the lake. So that's also perceptual grounding, and that again entails grounding the individual parts as well. So grounding the lake in a perceptual representation of a lake concept. Same for the tree, and also grounding left of in a perceptual representation of leftness, or of the spatial relation left of, and grounding the whole phrase by identifying the object in the visual input that is denoted by that phrase. In this case, the tree to the left of the lake, which would be this one here. And what I haven't shown so far is that there is also work in DFT on grounding verbs. And in the grounding paradigm, this has been addressed for movement relations. So verbs that denote a certain movement relation, like moving towards, for example. So that is a DFT model by Richter et al. 2018, I think. So you can find that paper on dynamicfieldtheory.org if you're interested in that, which receives a video as input, essentially, or like a dynamic scene where objects move towards other objects, or they're just multiple objects and they move in certain directions. And that model then enables the grounding of movement relations. For example, the relationship moving towards. So in other words, you could tell the model, look for the ball that moves towards the tree, and it would identify that object. So if we consider this example here, assume that the red ball is moving down, then this model is able to ground that phrase by finding the red ball that is in fact moving towards the tree. So the model actually it can only deal with colored balls, not with nouns, but the general ingredients are there for grounding such movement relations. So in a sense, then there's also work on the perceptual grounding of verbs. Of course, there's no claim made here that now we have DFT accounts that are able to ground arbitrary adjectives, arbitrary nouns, arbitrary prepositions, and arbitrary verbs, but they're just a handful of examples which serve to illustrate the key principles that are involved in the perceptual grounding process. But even under the assumption that we have a very large vocabulary and we can ground all kinds of prepositions, all kinds of adjectives, all kinds of nouns, and all kinds of verbs, this would still fall short of being an account for the perceptual grounding of language more generally. And that is because natural language has a particular feature which could be described as its creative nature, or sometimes it's also called productivity. So it's bringing across the notion of productivity is a bit difficult. So I'm gonna try that by adopting a metaphor. So productivity could be described as the ability to flexibly join so-called atomic linguistic units into so-called molecular linguistic units, and also further to join those molecular linguistic units into more complex molecular linguistic units. And first of all, think of this metaphor of atoms and molecules. So you know that atoms can combine to form structure called molecules, which are like atoms, which are arranged in a specific way, and molecules can combine with other molecules to form larger molecules. And language is, in a sense, like that. So to look at an example, that if we have the phrase the house, and we have the other phrase the lake, then we can join those phrases into a larger phrase, the house at the lake. And this can continue with a very large amount of flexibility. So, for example, we could join that phrase, the house at the lake, into yet a larger phrase, the big tree next to the house at the lake, right? So this is now what you might call a molecular phrase, which contains the smaller phrase, the house at the lake, as part. And this phrase, the house at the lake, is also a molecular phrase, which contains the house as part and also the lake as part, right? So language has this, what you could also call recursive nature. So language is composed of parts, which are themselves further composed of parts, just as a molecule. If this molecule metaphor doesn't make so much sense to you, you can forget about it. Just focus on this aspect of language then. Maybe you might also think, no, molecules have only atoms as their parts, no other molecules, that's fine. So this metaphor only goes so far. But in language, you could really say that phrases are composed of smaller phrases, and these smaller phrases are composed of yet smaller phrases. And at some point, you reach the so-called atomic level where you have individual words, right? So the individual words could be considered the atomic linguistic units, and they can be combined into molecular linguistic units, and they can be further combined into larger molecular linguistic units. So to drive this point to finish by yet another example, you can even form a complicated sentence or the phrase, the red ball moves towards the big tree next to the house of the lake. And of course, there's a certain limit to the kinds of sentences or phrases that humans would still be able to understand, at least without careful conscious analysis. But still, this doesn't really refute the argument that you have this recursive nature, even if there is a certain limit to that recursive nature, which is to be expected, of course, because the human mind has a limited capacity. You can't keep arbitrarily complex sentences or arbitrarily complex structures in short-term memory. There is a limit to that. Now, historically, there's been a particular proposal put forward in the literature as to how the human mind achieves productivity. And that proposal is often referred to as the principle of compositionality. And there are various different ways in which you can formulate the principle of compositionality. So in its modern incarnation, it's often stated along the following lines. The meaning of the whole is determined by the meanings of the parts and the way the parts are put together. I do not like to go with that particular definition, but I'm going to propose a related definition, which is quite similar, but it is a bit different, and I don't really want to dwell on the difference now. So I'm going to focus on this one, but you will not hear it exactly put in this form in the literature on compositionality, but I guess you can see the analogy. So the principle that I like to put forth is that humans understand a phrase by understanding the meanings of the individual words, which we refer to as concepts, and combining these concepts in accordance with how the words are arranged syntactically in the phrase. So let's look at an example. When we understand the phrase, a black swan sits below a tree, we do so by understanding the meanings of the individual words. So we understand the word black by associating it with the black concept. We understand the word swan by associating it with a swan concept. We understand the word below by associating it with a below concept. So concept is some perceptual representation that we're not defining specifically now, but let it just be noted for now that a concept generally is some neural representation that characterizes that category for the cognitive system, and that is used by the cognitive system when it understands language involving that concept. Yeah, we don't want to make a particular claim about what the concepts are. So for now, we just make a claim that there are these neural representations called concepts, and that they underlie our understanding of the meanings of individual words. So that's step one. That is one part of understanding that phrase or sentence. The second step is then we have to combine these concepts in a particular way in order to understand the whole phrase. And the question now is, how do we have to combine the concepts so that we actually understand the meaning of the phrase? And to make it clear why the syntactic arrangement is relevant here, I want to show you this other example here. So here on the left, we again have the example as before: a black swan sits below a tree, and this would be sort of the grounded meaning of that phrase, or a possible grounded meaning. And here we have the sentence: a swan sits below a black tree, and that would be the grounded meaning of that phrase, that sentence. And what we can see here is that both of these sentences are composed of the exact same words, but still they mean different things, right? So in other words, the words are arranged differently in these two sentences. And this is the reason why these two sentences mean something different. So that means this conceptual combination process cannot just take all the concepts and combine them just like that, but rather the way it combines the concepts must be in accordance with the way the words are arranged. And some of you might think now, okay, it might be in accordance with the way they are, the position they occur in as a sequence. But I would claim that's not enough, and that's also what the principle of compositionality claims. It's also relevant how the different components of the sentence are built out of parts and joined into larger units. And that is what we might call the syntactic arrangement in the phrase. Right? So in this example, we have to combine the concept of black with the concept of swan. And that gives us a grounded representation of black swan. And then the result of this combination, the black swan, that one is combined further with something else, with below and with tree, and also with sitting. Yeah, so one way you could phrase is that below a tree denotes a certain place, and the whole sentence denotes a certain event or action, and the action received as arguments, so to say, the place below a tree, and the one that does the sitting, namely the black swan. So the next notion then that I would like to introduce is the notion of conceptual structure. And that is a particular, it's actually the result of linguistic analysis. It's a proposed level of linguistic analysis put forward by the linguist Ray Jackendorf, or rather cognitive scientist. And that is a proposal for how to characterize the way in which concepts need to be combined in order to determine the correct meaning of a sentence or phrase. So if the phrase is black swan sits below a tree, then the conceptual structure can be depicted like this. So that's essentially roughly what I just showed in the previous slide. So there's an event characterized by the concept of sitting, and that event is performed by a certain object at a certain place. And the object is characterized by the concept swan and is modified by the property of being black. And the place is characterized by the concept below and sort of receives the location or the object below which that place is as an argument in a sense. And that object is characterized by the tree concept. Yeah, so the conceptual structure essentially characterizes how the concept need to be combined. So here, so this can be seen if you look so this is a tree structure, and if you look at the different components of the tree from the bottom to the top, you can see that the concept swan has to be combined with the concept black, or rather modified by the concept black. So you take a swan, you modify it with the black color, that gives you a grounded representation of an object, namely a black swan. And then you have to do the same here. So you take the concept of a tree, then you form a place below that, below the tree, essentially. And then finally, when you have a representation of the black swan and you have a representation of the place below the tree, you can combine those into an event, or rather you can use them as arguments for an event, which is characterized by the sit concept, and then that event is the interpretation of the whole sentence. Now, conceptual structure is just one proposal. So in the last decades, there have been numerous similar proposals under various different names, which sort of do similar things. And ultimately, we do not really know how the brain represents how it determines the way that the concept need to be combined. Whether this is the right picture or not, that remains to be seen. But there are certain so the problem is that we cannot look into human brains and really record how they do that. It's just not the right imaging machinery for that. But by analyzing the structure of language, we can make plausible claims about how it has to be done. And conceptual structure is essentially a proposal which is the result of analyzing language. So Ray Jekendorf is a linguist by training, and he has spent many decades analyzing language. And this way he came up with this notion of conceptual structure. And maybe this particular way of interpreting that sentence is not the correct one, but either way, something along these lines has to happen. That's really the important point that I want to make. So there's some structure which determines how the concept need to be combined in order to interpret the sentence. And an important property that we can see in such a structure is that we have a notion of binding here. So the various entities here are bound to other entities. So for example, the event is bound to an object and a place, and to a concept sitting. The object is bound to the concept swan and to a property which is bound to a concept black. And the place is bound to the concept below and to an object which is bound to a concept tree. So coming back to the principle of compositionality, so just to quickly restate the way that I formulated is, when humans understand the phrase, they do so by understanding the concepts, which are the meanings of the individual words, and combining these concepts in accordance with how the words are arranged syntactically. If we now say, okay, and the way that this happens is by virtue of combining them in accordance with the conceptual structure, then we can see that we really have to respect the conceptual structure in the conceptual combination. Or in other words, the processes in the human brain that combine the concepts, they do so in accordance with the conceptual structure. And so far we have introduced conceptual structure as a linguist's tool for characterizing the way that it has to happen. And now we take this claim further. And that's also something that Jekendorf himself proposed, namely that conceptual structure is explicitly represented in the brain, right? So, in other words, the most parsimonious way to account for how humans combine concepts in the correct way, or how they combine concepts in accordance with conceptual structure, is by assuming that conceptual structure is explicitly represented in the brain and guides the compositional and guides the conceptual combination process. So the high-level hypothesis then is this. So this is not precisely how Jekendorf himself frames it, but this is sort of a synthesis of our view and Jekendorf's view. So our idea is that when we hear a natural language utterance, then the language processing system of the brain transforms that utterance into a neural representation of the conceptual structure. And then the grounding processes which associate the concepts with their perceptual meanings, and also then with objects in the scene to establish reference, they make use of the conceptual structure. Yeah, and in doing so, they have to combine the various concepts in the way that is mediated by this neural representation of conceptual structure. So this, in this form, I think this is really a new theory in this particular way of formulating it, but it's of course very related to similar ideas from the literature. So that's sort of the synthesis of Jekendorf's view and the grounded cognition view, and also some additional view on the notion of conceptual combination, which emerge in psychology. And there's an additional argument that one can make, and we have made that argument in a paper that was released last year, is that this neural representation of conceptual structure must be a short-term memory. And I do not want to recap that argument now, but there are reasons to, or there are strong arguments to assume that at least over the time scale, over a few seconds, the conceptual structure is represented stably, at least stable over a certain time. So it cannot just be a transient structure that immediately decays. It has to be stabilized against decay. So this leads us to a key challenge. So if our goal is to account for how a neural network can implement a short-term memory of conceptual structure, we have to ask ourselves the more general question: how can a structure be represented in a neural short-term memory? Yeah, because so far, if we take the principles of dynamic field theory for granted, then the kinds of representations that we know, of which we know that how they can be stabilized, how they can serve as a neural short-term memory using the self-sustained fields, they do not tell us how to keep a structure in short-term memory, because in DFT the representations are peaks, either a single peak in a field or multiple peaks in a field, but these just represent individual feature values or individual object locations, for example. They do not represent a structure. And one of the key challenges that was sort of the one of the that I've been trying to solve in my PhD work is how can we use the principles of dynamic field theory in order to represent structures. And we call that a distinguishing characteristic of the structure is that you have this sort of dependency among components. So components are bound to each other in particular ways, which can then be characterized as a tree structure quite often. So think of the conceptual structure as a tree-like structure somehow branching out. Question is, how can neural networks represent structure? And in addressing this challenge, we have zoomed in on a particular subset of language that is called the class of so-called nested noun phrases. So generally, a noun phrase is a phrase that describes an object. So a simple example would be the tree or the lake or the red object. And the noun phrase can contain a so-called prepositional phrase as a part. So for an example for that would be the tree below the lake. Yeah, so below the lake is a so-called prepositional phrase, and that is a part of the noun phrase, the tree below the lake. So the whole phrase describes an object and contains a prepositional phrase as part. And importantly, the prepositional phrase below the lake contains another noun phrase as part, namely the lake, which is also a noun phrase. And that's why we would call this nesting, because we have a larger noun phrase, which contains a smaller noun phrase as part. And this nesting can continue up to a certain level of complexity. And we can see that humans are able to understand nested noun phrases up to a certain level of complexity. For example, the tree to the right of the tree below the lake. Yeah, so here we took this phrase, the tree below the lake, and made that the object of another prepositional phrase to the right of the tree below the lake. And this prepositional phrase is part of a larger noun phrase, the tree to the right of the tree below the lake. Another example would be something where you use a conjunction. So this would be a single phrase, the tree below the lake and above the house. Or some might feel more comfortable with saying the tree which is below the lake and above the house. This is also a form of nesting, but so here we have the noun phrase the lake, we have the noun phrase the house, we have the prepositional phrase below the lake, another prepositional phrase above the house, and then we have a larger prepositional phrase below the lake and above the house, and that is joined into a noun phrase, the tree below the lake and above the house, right? So that would be this one, for example, would be the grounded referent of that last noun phrase. So that tree is both below the lake and above the house. And you can get even more complicated than that also, although at some point it's no longer clear whether you can really claim that humans understand these phrases without really carefully analyzing or adopting a certain strategy for making sense of that. So one example that I like to give is the phrase, the tree to the right of the tree below the lake and above the house. So that's sort of like the limit that probes the limit of what humans can still understand. And that would surmount to identifying, for example, this tree here, which is to the right of the tree below the lake and above the house. But this, you can forget about this example. And the reason that these nested noun phrases are interesting is because they are relatively a clearly circumscribed subset of language that can already illustrate many of the key challenges that any model that wants to account for language understanding needs to account for. Yeah, so any neural model that claims to account for natural language grounding has to address these challenges. And they are now famously referred to as Jacobs challenges. And if you're not able to address these challenges, then you can make a case that it's you're not really capable to account for language grounding. You might have might be able to account for the grounding of a certain subset of language. So, for example, just grounding adjectives, grounding nouns, or grounding a single relationship like the tree below the lake. But humans can do more than that. And if you want to account for all of language grounding, then you have to show how humans achieve this feat. And this feat can be sort of summarized by two major challenges put forward by Ray Jacobs. So one of them is called the massiveness of the binding problem, or sometimes just the massive binding problem, or maybe simply the binding problem. And that is exemplified by the phrase, the lake above the tree above the house. So the challenge here is, we have the tree here, so description of an object, and that tree is simultaneously the reference object of the first phrase, the lake above the tree, and the target object of the second phrase, the tree above the house. So this shows what this is called a binding problem, because it requires a neural mechanism to flexibly bind the representation of the tree to two different relationships in two different roles. So if you paid careful attention to last week's models, then you might recall that we had concept nodes which can encode a phrase. So that's the Richter et al. 2014 model. And we had one set of concept nodes for the target role and another set of concept nodes for the reference role. And now this machinery cannot account for how we can have an object which is in the target role of one phrase and in the reference role of another phrase. And the related problem is also referred to as one of Jacobov's challenges. There's actually 4 of them, but I'm just gonna zoom in on these 2. So the second challenge is called the problem of 2. And that would be exemplified by the noun phrase, the small tree above the big tree. So the challenge here is, how can a neural short-term memory encode that there are 2 trees, one of them small and the other one big? So this requires more than just a tree concept node, the small concept node and the big concept node. So because if you just activate the tree node, the small node and the big node, then you cannot account for how that encodes that there are 2 trees and which of them is small and which of them is big. Yeah, otherwise the phrase the small big tree would be encoded in the exact same way. And actually the model we've seen by Richter last week, that is already able to solve the problem of 2, because we have 2 copies of the concept node, one of them in the target role and one of them in the reference role. But classical connectionist models, if that means something to you, these are not able to solve the problem of 2, and that's why it's important to mention it here. And we have come up with a particular proposal for how the problem of 2 and the massiveness of the binding problem can be solved in general in dynamic field theory. And we're now I'm now presenting that for the case of nested noun phrases, but let it be noted that the same principle can also be used more generally to solve these 2 challenges for all kinds of other grammatical constructions. So what does binding through index mean? There's multiple ingredients to this theory, actually. The first one is that we assume that the language preprocessing system of the brain embeds each mentioned object into a discrete index dimension. Another way to put this is that the language processing system assign a unique index to every mentioned object. Yeah, so we have this example phrase here, the tree, right of the tree, below the lake and above the house. So that's this super complicated example that I come up with because it demonstrates the problem of 2 and the massiveness of the binding problem at the same time, because there's 2 trees, and this tree here stands in 2 different relationships. It is both below the lake and above the house. Yeah, so it is the target object of 2 different relationships, and it is simultaneously the reference object of this relationship here. So the assumption is that we assign a unique index for every mentioned object, which uniquely identifies that particular object. The second ingredient then is a neural mechanism that enables binding objects to concepts by virtue of that index. And this is the neural field model that we came up with for that. So this actually introduces another notion of a neural field, or similar notion, namely the notion of a discrete neural field. So while you know that the kinds of neural fields that you have seen so far in DFT, they might be called continuous neural fields, and that is because the feature dimension over which they are defined is continuous. Examples would be spatial location. So spatial location does not come with particular discrete values. So you can't say, for example, I can either be here or there or there, but you can be in any location in between. That's why it's a continuous dimension. Space is a continuous dimension, and also the hue, the color is also continuous dimension, and also the various in the motor area. There are also various field models that also use continuous motor parameters, like grip force, or say the target location of the glass or something like that. So these are all continuous locations, and now we're introducing discrete dimensions. So discrete dimensions have only a fixed finite set of possible values. And to show you an example, so one of the discrete dimensions over which this field is defined is the object index dimension, and you can only have one of 4 values here along that dimension. It can be either 1, 2, 3, or 4. So we assume that there's a certain maximum. So there's a certain limit to the number of objects that you can encode in this new short-term memory. Just fix it to 4 here, because that's roughly compatible with data on human short-term memory, but this limit is to be taken with a grain of salt. We don't know the exact number. But the important point is that we have a field that is defined over this discrete object index dimension, which has just a finite set of possible values. And the second dimension over which this 2-dimensional field is defined is a discrete concept dimension. And that dimension has as its possible values the different concepts. Yeah, house, lake, tree, red, green, blue, and so on. And what this field, which we call the object concept field, does is it enables us to bind objects to concepts by virtue of inducing a P at the respective object index and the respective concept. Yeah, so if we look at this yellow peak here, which is now a rectangle because we have discrete dimensions, but this is it's completely analogous to a peak in the neural field. That peak encodes that the object with index 1 is bound to the concept tree. And this other peak here would encode that the object with index 2 is also bound to the concept tree. And similarly, object 3 is bound to lake, and object 4 is bound to house. So we can see that this new activation pattern encodes that there's a tree, there's another tree, there's a lake, and there's a house. And it keeps apart these various representations. Importantly, it keeps apart the 2 trees, which we wouldn't be able to do if we just had a single concept node for the tree concept. And we call this binding through index because it's analogous to binding through space. Yeah, so we call the notion of binding through space is the idea that the means by which the various features of an object are bound together is the spatial location. Yeah, so the idea is in the DFT model of binding through space that the various features like color, orientation, size, and so on, these are bound to the same object by virtue of the spatial dimension, so that you can, if you then want to look up what is the orientation of the red object, you can know this by first determining the spatial location of the red object using the color space field, and then you look up the orientation of the object at that location. That's binding through space, and binding through index is completely analogous to that. You can use the index in order to later, as we will see, look up the concepts that characterize an object with a given index, and also further things. So the index can now be used as a binding agent, which enables us to flexibly bind various representations to the same object by virtue of that index. And finally, let's maybe take a glimpse at the discrete neural field equation. So that's completely analogous to the continuous field equation. You have this minus u term, you have the resting level term, you have the input term. Just the only difference here is that the only difference in the first line is that x is a discrete dimension. Here comes a difference. So instead of the integral that formalizes lateral interactions, we have the single self-excitation term, which excites a spatial location with a certain degree. You could also possibly have slight lateral interactions, but we do not model that here. So that would mean lateral interactions between neighboring locations in this discrete field. And this one here models mutual inhibition between the field locations. Yeah, so for every pair of locations in this discrete dimension, they inhibit each other to a certain degree. Here we see now a different activation pattern in the same field, where we can see how this model would solve the problem of 2. So now object index 1 is bound to both the tree concept and the small concept. And object index 2 is bound to both the tree concept and the big concept. So we can see that this allows us to encode that there's a small tree and a big tree. And these two representations are kept apart. So that's step 1. So that enables us to bind objects to concepts. And if we maybe take a glimpse at the conceptual structure example here again, that would be possibility to bind this object here to this concept, for example. Yeah, but so bind that object to the concepts 1 and bind that object to the concept 3. But that's of course not all. So we also need a way to encode relationships among objects, or rather to bind objects to relationships, in particular relational roles. And in order to enable this, we further assume that each mentioned relationship is also embedded into a discrete index dimension by the language preprocessing systems. So here, for example, we would have the right-of relationship, which gets assigned in index 1, below relationship, which gets assigned in index 2, and the above relationship, which gets assigned in index 3. And now that we have this relationship index, we can come up with a field architecture that allows us to bind objects to relationships in particular roles by virtue of this index. And here we see an example for that. So this again recaps the various object indices and relationship indices. So we have the, again, tree with index 1, another tree with index 2, the lake with index 3, and the house with index 4. And also the relationship right off with index 1, relationship below with index 2, and the relationship above with index 3. And here's our proposal for how to bind objects to relationships in particular roles. So with these simple spatial relationships, we have two relational roles, the target role and the reference role. So we need a field that allows us to bind objects to the target role of a relationship. And that's the field to the left here. It's defined over the discrete object index dimension and the discrete relationship index dimension. And the peak in that field encodes that the object with the respective index is the target object of the relationship with the respective index. Yeah, so this here would encode that object 1 is the target of relationship 1. And we can see here in this smaller phrase, the tree to the right of the tree, we have here object 1, and that's the target object of this relationship with index 1. And that's exactly what is encoded here with this peak. So this peak binds object 1, the tree, to this relationship in the target role. And similarly, if we now look at this field here, which is also defined over the object in next dimension and the relationship in next dimension, that field allows to bind objects to the reference form of a particular relationship. So this peak here, for example, that binds the object with index2 to the relationship with index1. And this is precisely what we see here. So the object with index2 is the reference object of this relationship. So in the tree to the right of the tree, where the second dimension tree has index2, this object with index2 is the reference object. Yeah, and maybe if you want, you can pause the video for a minute and make sense of how the different peaks in these two fields here bind the various objects to the respective roles, to the correct roles in the various relationships up here. So perhaps one more thing I would like to mention is that in this noun phrase here, the tree, which is below the lake and above the house, the tree is the target object of two different relationships. It is both below the lake and above the house. And this is encoded by these two peaks here. So object 2 is the target of relationship 2, and object 2 is also the target of relationship 3. And finally, we have this peak, this field here, which enables us to bind concepts to relationships. So it's defined over a discrete relational concept dimension, where we have one possible value for every relational concept, like left, right, above, below. And we have a relationship index dimension as before, and the peak then encodes that the relationship with the respective index is bound to the respective concept. So for example, the relationship with index 1 is bound to the right of concept. So R is short for right of. And this is exactly encodes this here, that the relationship with index 1, which is actually the relationship expressed by this whole phrase here, tree to the right of the tree, that relationship is characterized by the right of concept, encoded by this peak. And similarly, the relationship with index 3 is characterized by the above concept. Yeah, so that's this above house, that's this one here is the above concept, which is bound to the object with index 3. Yeah, and this is actually the way that you might draw the conceptual structure expressed by this phrase here in the kind of notation that we've seen before, but I don't want to zoom in on that. So perhaps just very quickly, so we have object 1, which is bound to the tree concept, and also bound to a certain relationship, and that relationship is also bound to the right of concept, and further bound to a certain object, which is bound to the tree concept and to two different relationships. And these two relationships are further bound. So if you want to make sense of that, maybe also pause the video and see how this binding can be characterized using this abstract linguistic notation, and also how this activation pattern over the neural fields encodes that structure. So that's the key point that I would like to make now. So this field here, the object concept field, and these three fields here, so these four fields together, they enable to encode arbitrary conceptual structures by virtue of inducing particular activation patterns in those fields. So that's essentially our proposal for how to neurally encode conceptual structure as a neural activation pattern, if the goal is to be consistent with the neural principles of DFT. So that's the first step in accounting for compositionality. So that allows us to encode how the concepts need to be combined in order to determine the meaning of the phrase or sentence. The second step then is how to ground that conceptual structure. So how to actually form the conceptual combination processes, such as to ultimately ground the whole phrase. And the first observation that is important to realize when we want to understand this is that not all of the object descriptions can simultaneously have an effect on the grounding processes due to limited attentional capacities, right? So we're now talking about a grounding process where the cognitive system is perceiving a certain visual scene and is trying to ground the complex phrase in perception, which means ultimately identifying the location of the described object in the visual input. And the grounding machinery that you're familiar with from previous lectures, which enables visual search and relation processing, that one can only search for one object at a time because the visual search machinery is limited to searching for one object at a time. So, in other words, we have this conceptual structure composed of multiple objects, but only one of them can be searched for at a time. So, not the entire conceptual structure immediately affects the entire grounding process, but rather the various components of the conceptual structure, they affect the grounding process one object at a time. And also, studies show that only one relationship can be verified at a time or processed at a time. Yeah, so looking back at this example, we cannot simultaneously look for, zooming in on this subphrase, we cannot look immediately for the tree which is both below the lake and above the house. But rather, we first have to look for the tree which is below the lake, and then we can check whether it's also above the house. So, and that's because the relational machinery, which enables the processing relationship, that can also only process one relationship at a time. And there's empirical evidence for that. Actually, these studies do not address that so explicitly, but in the topics paper, so that's like this paper here, which you can also find on the website, there we make a case for why this essentially follows from those empirical studies. And now I want to show the next challenge that we had to solve, which is to couple the neural short-term memory of conceptual structure to the grounding machinery, such as to effectively ground the object or all the objects described in the conceptual structure in the visual scene, one object and one relationship at a time. And here we see how that is neurally spelled out. So here on the left, we have the same object concept field that just encodes the bindings of objects to concept in short-term memory. And down here, we have the fields that encode the bindings of objects to relationships, in particular roles. And the first ingredient now is we have to essentially make a selection decision about which object to find next. So we assume that there's a target production field, which is defined over the discrete object index dimension and just selects one object at a time. So here in this example, it has selected the object with index 4. And the first thing that has to happen is now the bound information, the information that is bound to the object with index 4 has to be read out from the conceptual structure. And for this purpose, we have what we call here a production field that receives input from the object concept field. That's the object concept production field. So it receives subthreshold input from the object concept field. And also it receives slice input from the target production field. And where these two inputs overlap, the field forms a peak. So that's like the discrete analogon to the visual search mechanism. So since peak is here at object index 4, we have input along this column. And since the, so prior to this peak formation, if I go back in time, we see that there's only subthreshold input at the respective concepts bound to the objects. So by providing this column input, the field forms a peak on all the concepts which are bound to object index 4. And this can then be summed and provide input into a one-dimensional concept production field that here then has formed a peak on house. So that essentially allows us to look up the concepts that are bound to the objects, or the concepts that are bound to the object that is currently selected for search from the conceptual structure. And this concept production field that then projects to the visual search machinery in order to identify the location of the object characterized by the house concept, which here has the index 1. And I don't want to really present the visual search machinery now, but yeah, let it just be noted that the concept production field projects to that machinery and thereby triggers a search for houses. And the result then is a peak on the house in the target candidate field. Will become clear later why it's called a target candidate field. And subsequently, the grounding system signals that it has found the described object using a condition of satisfaction. And when that happens, that object is stored in a mental map. So a mental map is just a field, this one here, which is actually three-dimensional. So it's defined over the two spatial dimensions of the visual input and a discrete object index dimension, and it stores the locations of objects with the respective index. So here it has essentially stored the location of the house. So maybe I should simultaneously show you the picture of the scene in which this search is performed. Yeah, so it has triggered this. It has previously had selected object index 4, which has triggered a visual search for houses, and that search was successful. So it correctly identified the object with index 4 by forming a peak in the target candidate field, and that location, which is in the image, is this location here, is then stored in the mental map at the index that is currently selected in the target production field. Yeah, so the mental map keeps track of the locations of the objects that it has previously identified for the respective indices. And when this happens, the peak in the target production field is destabilized and a new search is triggered. So, or rather, the target production field is then again boosted to enable forming a new peak. And because we have this inhibition of return field, it won't select index 4 again. It will now select a new index. So now it has triggered a search for object index 3. And again, up here, it reads out the concept associated with that object index and triggers a search. So in this case, the concept is the lake, or the concept of a lake, and then it triggers a search for concepts, for the objects characterized by the lake concept. And if we now go into the future moment, we see that the target candidate field now correctly identifies the location of the lake, and it subsequently stores that location again in the mental map, this time at object index 3. And again, the peak in the target production field is destabilized. And now it becomes more interesting, because now we form a peak on object index 2. And according to the conceptual structure, let me see if I have that here. No, unfortunately not. So according to the conceptual structure of object 2 is both below the lake and above the house. So it stands in certain relationships to other objects. So finding that object would entail, so finding the correct reference of that object requires that you find an object which is both below the lake, which you have previously identified, and above the house, which you have previously identified. And this is achieved by this machinery here. So first of all, we have a relationship production field here, which is just defined over the relationship index dimension. And the peak in the target production field provides slice input into this target relationship production field, which receives additional input from the target relationship field. Yeah, so recall that the target relationship field enables to bind objects to the target role of a certain relationship. And if we now want to look up the relationships that have the object with index 2 in their target role, we can do so by virtue of this field. So the object index 2 provides input in this column. And since here in the target relationship field, the object with index 2 has relationship 2 as one of the relationships that contain object 2 in its target role, the field forms a peak here. So the field is selective. That means it doesn't simultaneously form peaks on both relationships here. It selects one of them. And this is then read out and provides input into the one-dimensional relationship production field. So this now essentially effectively resulted or caused the system to look up the relationship index or one of the relationship indices that contain object 2 in their target role. And now that we know that object 2 is the target of the relationship with index 2, next the system has to look up what is the reference object and what is the relational concept that characterizes that relationship. So what other information is bound to that relationship in the conceptual structure. And this is achieved by these two fields here. So they receive input here from the reference relationship field and here from the relationship concept field. And also they receive slice input from the relationship production field. And where these two inputs overlap, the fields form peaks. So this effectively enables the system to look up which objects are bound to relationship 2 in this example in the reference role. And you can see here that object 2 is bound to object 3 in the reference role, or to put it the other way around, the object with index 3 is bound to the reference role of the relationship with index 2. And that's why this field here forms a peak there. And that is again read out into this one-dimensional reference production field and effectively results in a peak on object index 3. Yeah, so the system has thereby looked up what is the index of the reference object of relationship 2, the target object of which was this object index 2. And this system, this field here analogously enables to look up which concepts or which relational concept characterize the relationship with index 2. So again, the relationship production field provides a rich input here, and that is then read out. So effectively here, the peak on the below concept is formed. So in other words, if we now look at these three fields together, we see that these encode a phrase, object 2, below object 3. Yeah, so that essentially now triggers the search system to search for a tree which is below reference object 3. And the location of reference object 3 had previously been stored in the mental map, which means the visual search system can now take the location of the object with index 3, and now search for a tree below that location. And maybe it's of interest to have a glimpse at how this might work. So we have here a spatial selection bias field that receives a bias pattern corresponding to a below pattern centered on the spatial location of the reference object. And thereby it highlights the locations below object 3. And additionally, it highlights the locations which are trees. And the target candidate field selects one of them. So it effectively finds an object which is a tree and which is below object 3, namely this one. And coming back to the larger phrase, so we call that object T2 is the target object of 2 different relationships, one of which the system has just processed below object 3, but the other one that it's above object 4 has not been processed yet. So in other words, the fact that here this target candidate has been found doesn't yet lead the system to commit that to the mental map. So this is only a candidate so far, because it might be the case that the object it has selected as a candidate for an object that is below the lake might not also be above the house. So in other words, it would not match all of the relationships. So that's why it has to keep that in a short-term memory now and trigger the next search. So the peak in the relationship production field is now destabilized, but the peak in the target production field is not. And there's a particular process organization which orchestrates it like that. I don't want to explain that now. But importantly, now the relationship production field forms a peak on the other relationship that contains object 2 in its target role, using the exact same mechanism as before. And again, the reference object index of that relationship is read out. It's object with index 4, which is reflected by this peak in the reference production field. And it's characterized by the concept above, reflected by this peak on the above concept in the relational concept production field. So this now causes the visual search system to verify whether the object that is the candidate for object 2 that we have previously selected is also above object index 4. And yeah, I do not want to go into detail as to how that works, but importantly, when it detects that that relationship match as well, and that ultimately all of the relationships match, the system sort of concludes that this is the object that it was looking for, and it stores its location in the mental map field. So we have now found the house, the lake, and the tree which is below the lake and above the house. And the last part of this example phase that the system is currently processing is it now has to find the tree which is to the right of that other tree. And this now works exactly the same way. So the target production field now forms a peak on object index 1, the last remaining object that it hasn't found yet. And it again looks up the concept that characterized that object, here the tree, and also the relationship that contains object 1 in its target role, and that is the relationship with index 1, which is characterized by which has object 2 as its reference object. Yeah, so it has that tree as its reference object, and it's characterized by the right of concept. And so the system is now triggered to search for a tree which is to the right of object 2. and object 2 was the object which is both below the lake and above the house. So this shows how the final object, the tree to the right of the tree, which is below the lake and above the house, has been found bottom up in a sense. And this essentially accounts for how compositionality can be achieved, at least in the example case for nested noun phrases. So to conclude this talk, we have presented a neural dynamic process model that can perceptually ground a nested noun phrase. And nested noun phrases exemplify many of the challenges that already need to be solved in models of language grounding more generally. And that's why this is not a small step, actually. And if our goal now is to account for other grammatical constructions, we contend that we are likely to reuse many of the same components. We just would introduce new kinds of relational roles. But ultimately, it always boils down to having objects and relationships between the objects, where these relationships can also be actions, actually. So if you want to account for how we understand sentences or ground sentences which contain a verb, then this is in a sense also a relationship. So the same neural mechanism can also be used to solve that. And actually we have built a model now that does exactly that, which I'm not going to present in detail now, but perhaps this can be the last impression for today. So this combines the conceptual structure mechanism which we've seen previously, depicted on the left, with the grounding machinery. In this case, in order to ground the sentence, the red ball moves towards the big tree, which is to the left of the lake and to the right of the house. But I'm not going to explain that now. So I'll just leave that impression. And if you want to pause, you can maybe try to make sense of what the various components of the architecture are. We have the perceptual scene representation, we have visual search mechanism, we have feature fields that provide input to the visual search mechanism, and we have these concept production nodes that project to these feature fields in order to trigger the search for objects characterized by certain concepts. We have a relational machinery that allows us to sort of search for objects which stand in a certain relationship to a certain reference object. And we have a mental map that allows us to keep the locations of objects that we have previously found in short-term. And finally, we have a process organization system that orchestrates the various components so that the entire system works autonomously, just receives the visual input and the conceptual structure, and then it completely autonomously finds the denoted objects, and then ultimately it verifies whether the sentence is true by checking whether all of the relationships hold among the various objects. So I thank you for your attention, and so looking forward to discussing this with you